Good morning, members. As Clerk of the Legislative Assembly, it is my duty to call this first meeting of the Territorial Leadership Committee to order and to preside over the nominations for Premier, the subsequent candidate speeches and question period. Please rise as Elder Paul Andrew leads us in a prayer and contemplation.
When our elders tell us before you start a meeting, our elders used to say, start with a prayer. In the past, that's how it is tradition to open a meeting with a prayer.
However it is that one prays, that we always pray. And they always remind us of our obligations to the little one, yet unborn. That we have an obligation and a responsibility to those who are yet to come. And hopefully, Creator willing, we will leave them a world that is better than the one that we inherited. My grandfather had 52 songs, very spiritual songs. Songs that sustained the people of the mountains for many years, and even though he is gone over 70 years ago, we still sing his songs and practice what he taught us. And we try to carry out what he instructed with some degree of humility and with a hope that it will continue to sustain us and help us. Today, I want to pray for all the animals that live in the sky, all the animals that live on earth and in earth, all the animals that live on the water and in the water. I'm going to ask the Creator to look after the leaves and the trees and the water. And I ask the Creator to help you in your deliberations. Our elders also tell us that we all pray differently. And they invite each and every one of you to pray the way that you would pray, and also pray to the ones that you would pray to. I'm going to acknowledge the four directions to signal the circle that we are part of. And that's what my grandfather always talked about. That's how we help each other in that circle. And we always look out for each other in that circle. Creator, we thank you for our grandfathers and our grandmothers and our moms and our dads, for their songs and their stories, and for their love, their unconditional love. We thank you for all the animals that live in the waters and the animals that live on the land and in the land, and we thank you for the ones that live in the trees. Creator, we thank you for one more day. We thank you for humility and wisdom and gratitude. We thank you for the laughter of the little ones, the wisdom, the knowledge of the older ones, and the people that reach out to help each other. Merci, merci. Have a good day. Merci.
Thank you, Elder Paul Andrew. Members, please be seated. Members, before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize a number of people in the visitors gallery today. First, Mr. Norman Yakalaya, former member, former minister with the Legislative Assembly, currently National Chief of the Dene Nation. And also Ms. Wendy Bizero, former member of the Legislative Assembly. Welcome to you both. As mentioned, this is the first meeting of the Territorial Leadership Committee for the members of the 19th Legislative Assembly. All members have a copy of the agenda in front of them. Are there any additions or deletions to the agenda? Seeing none, is the agenda adopted? We're agreed? Thank you, members. Members and those following along in the public gallery and at home, you have previously confirmed a process to select the Premier that varies somewhat from the past. Your predecessors from the 18th Legislative Assembly divided the process for the selection of Premier from a one-day process to a two-day process. As you have agreed, the process for selecting a Premier for the 19th Legislative Assembly will be divided into two distinct stages. Today, those members wishing to allow their names to stand for Premier will each identify themselves publicly and make a speech of up to 20 minutes. Following these speeches, each member will be entitled to ask up to 2 questions to each candidate for Premier. Your questions should be addressed equally to all candidates, and I ask that you keep them short and specific. Likewise, I ask that candidates limit their responses to no more than 5 minutes. Following this question and answer exchange, the Territorial Leadership Committee will adjourn for roughly 1 week until Thursday, October the 24th, 2019 at 9 a.m., when you will first select a speaker. Following this, each member will be provided the opportunity to ask one final question to the candidates for Premier. This final exchange will be followed by the secret ballot election of the Premier. Later that afternoon, you will proceed to identify, hear speeches from, ask questions to, and elect members of the Executive Council, according to the 222 or North-South Yellowknife custom that has been used by previous assemblies. Now, with regard to technical matters, members should be aware that you are not required to turn on your microphones when you rise to speak. That will be done automatically for you. Also, in front of members and built into your desks are the timing mechanisms. When speeches are being made, the clocks will count down the time available to you, and you are asked to be mindful of the time limits that have been set and agreed to by all members. I wish to make members aware that today's proceedings are being broadcast live on the Legislative Assembly television network and on social media. Our proceedings today are being simultaneously translated in the following languages: in Booth 2 on Channel 2, Clichon; in Booth 3, Chipewyan; in Booth 4, South Slavey; in Booth 5, North Slavey; in Booth 6, Inuvialuktun; in Booth 7, Inuktitut; and in Booth 8, French. I would also like to remind members that although this is a less formal committee than the House itself, members are please asked to stand while speaking. The next item on the agenda is item 5, nominations for Premier. The Premier nominations and candidate speech guidelines are in your packages and are on your desks in front of you. As per the guidelines, my first duty is now to ask all members that wish to allow their names to stand for the position of Premier to please rise in their places. Thank you. Nominated for Premier then are Mr. R.J. Simpson, Mr. Lafferty, Ms. Cochrane, and Ms. Martselos. Thank you. You may be seated. So we will now proceed to the speeches by the 4 candidates for Premier. Each candidate is permitted to make a 20-minute speech, and the speeches will be made in alphabetical order by surname. As such, I will first call upon Ms. Cochrane for her speech. Ms. Cochrane, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today I am seeking this Assembly's support for the position of Premier of the 19th Legislative Assembly. I believe my background provides me with the insight, experience, and education necessary to consider all needs of the Northwest Territories and guide this Assembly effectively as a consensus government. As a minister who held 7 portfolios over the last 4 years in the 18th Legislative Assembly, I also gained a perspective on the operations and procedures within government, especially what worked and what didn't work. I believe I have the experience and commitment to lead this government within the true spirit of consensus government. My heart is in the North. My family moved to Yellowknife 56 years ago when I was a small baby. My partner Rory moved here in his early teens, and together we have a blended family with children and a grandchild living here. My commitment is to the long-term prosperity of the North, its people, and its programs and services that people need to live a healthy and prosperous life. I am also a proud Métis woman, and my Indigenous mother and non-Indigenous father have instilled a sense of caring for all people. Like many, my life was not always easy. I experienced the hardships of family addiction, violence, and homelessness. As a single parent of 2 young children, I understood that education was the key to not only my future, but also for theirs. I returned to school and obtained a degree in social work. Before entering this Legislative Assembly, I dedicated 20 years to supporting the needs of our most marginalized populations. I understand from a personal and a professional perspective that we need to weigh in the needs of all sectors in defining our priorities, direction, and actions. As we move forward, I have confidence you will find that I have a balanced perspective, I am open and honest, and above all, I consider the needs of all people and all communities. On October 9th, I listened to all MLAs who spoke on the needs of their constituents. I heard the need to consider the sustainability of the earth and the impacts of climate change, the need to consider the housing, health, education, and wellness needs of our people and our communities, the need for addressing the economic crisis the Territories is facing, and the need to work together as we address these concerns. The Premier and Cabinet are responsible to develop a 4-year mandate that meets the priorities outlined by this Legislative Assembly. Collaboration within the consensus model is important to its success, and if elected Premier, I will ensure regular MLAs are included in the finalizing of the government's mandate to meet these priorities. I will also ensure the mandate will have realistic outcomes and all actions will include department leads and timelines to ensure accountability. As Premier, I will, with your help, make our vision a reality. As Premier, I will also hold my ministers accountable through public mandate letters that will outline the priorities of each department. Ministers and departments will be directed to work closely with Indigenous governments, NGOs, and service providers to provide comprehensive programming and supports. I will not stand before you and tell you which priorities I think are most important, because they all are. I also believe that if we're going to work within a consensus system, the priorities need to be addressed will be defined together by all 19 members. However, I want to take some time to discuss the priorities that I feel are important to me. The economy. Our economy is in trouble. Small businesses are struggling to survive, Diamond mines are slowing down, and large non-renewable resource businesses are slow to start. We need to act fast, and we need to act now to ensure that jobs for today and jobs for tomorrow. As Premier, I'll work with ministers to develop a 10-year strategic economic plan that include Indigenous government engagement, departmental and stakeholder needs, a review of potential supports, including federal funding sources, royalties, investor potential, taxes, recognizing the already high cost of living, export potential, and a review of trade barriers, tourism, knowledge economy, a risk management plan, and standing committee engagement. I'll also work with relevant ministers and standing committee to develop a 4-year action plan based on the strategic economic plan that includes measurable actions and timelines. The plan must be flexible to match any funding possibilities that may arise and be reviewed or revised on an annual basis. Recognizing we have almost 45,000 residents and 33 communities, prosperity for all must be a guiding principle. Economic planning, infrastructure allocations, procurement, and investments must be done with this in mind, and our economic strategy must consider the needs of the larger and the smallest of our communities. All residents want to know that prosperity, jobs, and property values are secure for the long term, and we must work together to meet the needs of all. The mineral resources sector provides 40% of our gross domestic product. It is and will continue to be an important part of our economy. However, we need to build on the successes of previous governments to meet our economic needs. As Premier, I'll give direction to bring together industry and environmental experts, Indigenous and community government representatives, and regular members for a summit on the current and future state of resource development in the Northwest Territories and how we can find collaborative solutions to move forward together in a sustainable manner. Develop the regulations for the Mineral Resources Act as a priority to be done collaboratively with Indigenous governments and in consultation with all stakeholders, including the Chamber of Mines, Chamber of Business, and community governments. Increase investment in mineral exploration and consider strategic infrastructure investments that can extend mine life and help reduce exploration costs for future mining investments. Support diversification by expanding the tourism market internationally with a focus on promoting the smaller communities. Continue investing in green energy and renewable technology, farming, fishing, forestry, biomass production, tourism, culture, arts and film, and the Indigenous traditional economy. Growing the knowledge economy by creating a Polytech University that will bring additional research funding to the North, maintain the knowledge in the North, and allow us to become leading experts in addressing climate change, maintaining and revitalizing Indigenous languages, and development of environmentally friendly, renewable and non-renewable technology. And continue to support the Small Community Employment Fund and the Small Community Committee to oversee the program design and funding distribution. And to better support the range of needs within our economy, change the name of Industry, Tourism and Investment to the Department of Economic Diversification and Development. At the same time, we need to do more to support local businesses and strengthen our procurement policies. We have to invest in our people and focus on getting our own residents to work, which will help increase our revenues, provide pride in our people, and lessen the reliance on social programs. As Premier, I will ensure that this is implemented through developing infrastructure projects in partnership with Indigenous and community governments with the goal of having economic development opportunities in all regions of the Northwest Territories. Working in partnership with Indigenous and community governments to lobby the federal government for large-scale projects such as the Mackenzie Valley Highway, Tolson expansion, and the road into the Slave Geological Province that will create good jobs and support sustainable development. If chosen as your Premier, I commit to work with Cabinet and regular members and meet with all Indigenous and community governments to develop a territorial-wide economic strategy and work in partnership to pursue funding from the new federal government. However, we must ensure that we are fiscally responsible and working in a strategic, sustainable manner. We need to look at how we can deliver quality programs in the long term, so we have to think differently about how we do business. We will need to make some hard decisions and look at our programs and services to ensure that they are still meeting their intent and look at ways that we can provide them in a more efficient, effective manner. Protecting our environment. We're at the forefront of climate change. The sustainability and future of the Northwest Territories for future generations needs to be a priority of this government and all actions taken by the GNWT as we move forward. If elected Premier, I commit to the establishment of a climate change working group made up of Cabinet members, regular MLAs, community and Indigenous leaders to help advance the territorial climate change priorities. A full review of the 2030 NWT Climate Change Strategic Framework and the 2019 to 2023 Action Plan to ensure that it's meeting our needs. Supporting small communities in their efforts to get off diesel and develop cleaner sources of energy production. Increase funding to Arctic Energy Alliance to allow improved programs and services across the territory. And change the name of Environment and Natural Resources to Environment and Climate Change. The work the government of the Northwest Territories is doing to combat climate change needs to be given the recognition and the focus that it deserves. Any new infrastructure needs to reflect our changing climate and incorporate measures to lessen the need for non-renewable resources. Excuse me. The Polytechnic University can be a leader in working with Indigenous knowledge keepers in climate change adaptation and mitigation research. This includes becoming leaders in contaminated site remediation. If selected as Premier, I will also focus on international relationships that not only look to their best practices on climate change, but also to share our own. Investing in people. While resource development makes up a significant part of our economy, our greatest resource is our people. I will not stand here and say that we can make a significant dent in the cost of living in the NWT. However, what I can say is by investing in our people and giving them the foundation that they need for success, we can stabilize the cost of living. As our economy changes, and with our current debt limit, we must be creative and strategic in our expenditures, while at the same time trying to meet the needs of our residents. As Premier, I will give direction to look for innovative practices to address the CMHC housing funding, which will end in 2038. This could include placing a higher priority on home ownership and lease-to-own options for residents who are able to maintain their own homes, which will allow us to build more homes. Amalgamate the Department of Lands and Department of Municipal and Community Affairs as a more cost-effective and efficient way of delivering the services needed by Indigenous and community governments. Place a higher emphasis on senior residences to meet the growing demographic. In communities where able, senior residences should be based on a cost recovery model by incorporating market and subsidized units. Develop a model for affordable, universal childcare across the NWT, whether it be at a reduced cost or free. We will have to explore the options and work towards this in the long term. Place a higher focus on pre- and postnatal and parenting supports to assist in increasing the number of children developmentally ready for school. Increased support and focus for the JK to 12 education system, recognizing the critical developmental milestone periods with the goal of supporting our youth to successfully graduate. Make a reality the Polytechnic University by building on 3 strong communities, 3 strong campuses, and at least 21 strong community learning centers. Increase focus on rehabilitation and restorative justice and partnerships with educational and wellness support and Indigenous governments and organizations with the goal of successfully reintegrating offenders into society, housing, and employment options. Study options for specialized courts to better suit the needs of vulnerable residents with addictions and mental health issues. Add supports to health and social services, as well as focusing on a stronger recruitment and retention strategy. Training Northerners for these roles also needs to be a key priority. Pilot a guaranteed income model with long-term income support clients. This will assist people in having sustainable income that promotes accessing additional employment options and reduces the administration time and costs for the government of the Northwest Territories. An increased focus on the children in care to ensure they're provided the same standard of care we expect for our own children. We must also explore options with Indigenous governments for them to take a leadership role for our children in care. The use of an equity-based and gender-based analysis in any new program or service delivery to ensure we are truly focused on services that meet the needs of our residents. We also need to revisit our decentralization policy to ensure the benefits of decentralization can be felt in the regions. Modern treaties and self-government. The settling of modern treaties and providing supports for self-government is critical, both for the wellness and prosperity of Indigenous people, but also to help restore confidence to potential investors that the Northwest Territories is a place to do business. I believe a core component to completing these agreements is trust. I have made it a personal priority to be honest, fulfill my commitments, and foster good working relationships with Indigenous governments, and I believe this will be an asset as we continue this process. It's time to focus more on collaboration and partnerships, and that means changing the way we interact with Indigenous governments. If elected as your Premier, I will meet on a regular basis with the leadership of all Indigenous governments that are in negotiations in an effort to advance negotiations and address any obstacles. We must advance our shared goal of a strong and sustainable future on the foundation of respect, recognition, and shared responsibility. We need to conclude the outstanding agreements in order to bring increased certainty to land and resource management and economic opportunities for communities and regions. It's about relationships. It's about working together. Let's get these agreements completed so we can move forward on building our economy and building strong communities and people. Intergovernmental relationships. I said relationships are key to success, and as such, it's imperative that we work with our Member of Parliament so we have a strong voice in Ottawa. We need to work with our Indigenous and community governments if we're truly going to represent the needs of all residents. As Premier, I commit to the development of a strategic federal engagement plan that takes into consideration the needs of regular MLAs, Indigenous and community governments, so we have a shared message and approach to lobbying Canada for what we need. These meetings will be the basis in Ottawa to meet with federal ministers and bring forward our common concerns. We must also build strong alliances with our territorial and provincial counterparts to ensure everyone is aware of our exceptional challenges in the North. The 3 territories working in partnership on issues, when applicable, has been extremely beneficial, and we need to foster these partnerships as we go forward. As a consensus government, we must all work together. The nonpartisan political structure we have provides us the luxury of being able to work collaboratively with any federal or provincial or territorial government. We must utilize the strength that we have in our consensus government and build strong, nonpartisan relationships with all governments. In conclusion, my message today is built on experience and our past efforts as a government. I believe we must learn from our past to determine our future. We will have many challenges ahead. However, if we work together within the true spirit of consensus government, we'll be able to tackle these challenges together and achieve ultimate success for this Assembly, for all communities, and for all residents of the Northwest Territories. I will work within a philosophy of inclusion, transparency, and accountability. I am committed to fostering a working environment that is centered on engagement, collaboration, and innovation, and I will carry the ultimate goal of providing the best programs and supports to all residents of the Northwest Territories within my heart. I would be honored to serve as your Premier in the 19th Legislative Assembly, and I respectfully request your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cochran. Members, I'd like to draw your attention to the presence in the gallery of Grand Chief George Mackenzie from the Clicquot government, as well as Mr. Henry Zoe, a former member of the Legislative Assembly and a former minister. Members, next we have, in terms of alphabetical order, Mr. Lafferty. Mr. Lafferty, the floor is yours.
Merci, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair,
I would like to acknowledge that we are on Chief Dragi's Acacho territory. I would like to acknowledge that in this House and in the Northwest Territories, we stand on the land of Dene, Métis, Inuvialuit, and NWT Cree. Congratulations to all the newly elected MLAs. I look forward to serving in the 19th Legislative Assembly with all of you. Masicho to constituents of Montfi for their confidence in me as their representative in the Legislative Assembly. It has been a privilege to serve Clinchon people for the last 14 years and an honor to continue serving for the next 4 years. Masi to my wife Diane and my children, Jaden and Jesse, Cheyenne, Sahara, Dene, Ty, and our grandson Aries for their love and support. I am Jackson Lafferty. My father is Morris Lafferty. He spent much of his life on the land. He was a trapper, a dog musher, and provided for us what he harvested. He was adopted to and raised by Mairdale Lamoille. My grandmother also had a hand in raising me, as I was the oldest grandson. My mother is the late Dora Marie Lafferty. She was a Clinchon interpreter for Bichocon Health Center. Her parents, Pierre and Margaret Mantla, who raised their children on the land. To this day, I look at my uncle.
it is a Dene way. Introducing ourselves in this way allows us to situate ourselves and gives context to relations we have with each other. It shows our history.
Either to join relationship at all like that. You had to join government, had to miss in. You government Northwest Territories, but all like that, you want to do. You thought it tells you. Yung matawalay ta kasi sinwityo. No. It's English. You're in English. Where is it?
Culture that values respect,
Et adresi ayune let away hegalat et around et ajoka Gashinena Kyonosola Hag, away lesson chili liku, a katikane, then a kega go away said go hega like that, a jotown Nakiono o city jo, so like etere where hin legots at inti high, say, ek away say, and I want to own thing hajo, like tagots at a car, ek olago at alque, go sagarago kid there, ek olakandi, each speaker's chair heritage. And
A good soon. I have also had the opportunity to work among some of the great leaders, among them
Johnny Natsiza, the International Chief Billy Rasmus, Hutiha Azan Gade. Okay, the Huti Masi Gay Honda. Nizi has a get home, Nizi has a get Holani, that's a deal. I saw a easy logo. Huti, check it down again, Gade again. Fish a lot of data. I saw on the Masi get the right ground there. The deal that now what thing I get you on there. Huti, Tanda Takon, get a lot of down there. The negation how the negotiation how way, that's out there. The Yachi.
Ajo Pierre Beaver ho uya gosanet it did it dedicated agalats at dago dedicated but then it's 18 I but I got at the dedicated and now we're around at a do bit that we talk on but it's all a Pierre Cati. Oh, it's in Leanded at the egots at dago then Cati. Oh, it's in Linde. And nason de Canitiago there is aye and the Wenacanic Egalinta, Mr. Beaver Hog Alacati, Egile Wotani, Ayune Wokas and Tegola. And at there is a let's a hanet and it's a head count had it. And at there is a Ayune, that's a money, but at the Egilets are money, but at the Ayune got a played Yaki Tond and you can't atleverate at the pier, a collad at the negoti during at safety and a unit senatine, but on it had the canning the bet at the Cayunes or the hair like that. Massi, the pier, who say, GP Massi. A unit that daily Siniconity Band Councillor, he think, Nakionos a guy, series the good deed, and Agani was Becotina said. Goodinat says, Annie, or and that did is to be Calabigodia, I toss it, I told a cat did Kayas, and not that catty, and at Joe, you know, let's at that say, Egilet, it's Shale, I hear at Egilet and a Wonto, yet it all go, can it, I'm on the floor. I'm talking slavey.
Yeah. Sorry, keep going.
And I see Kanye unit hegalats at that and
Are you
no
in English?
From my perspective, as speaker, as minister, and as an MLA, I don't think we have. And that's where this assembly, under the right leadership, can make a difference. I believe it is possible for the executive and regular members to genuinely work together to achieve a common cause and a collective vision. Northerners demanded. For the sake of our youth, our education system, community wellness, decent housing for all, economic diversity, climate change, caribou, and many other challenges that confront our territory. We need a leader that will work with all 18 members in the spirit of servant leadership, one who is open-minded and a good listener, one who will explore all sets of issues and opportunities before making a decision, a leader who has respect for different perspectives, one who will collaborate and work with all levels of government in order to get the job done, a leader who looks beyond narrow interests to the greater good of all, who inspires others to do the same, a leader who leads to serve. I believe I am that leader. During the 18th Assembly, there were no small communities represented on cabinet. Ministers were only drawn from Yellowknife, Hay River, Inuvik, and Fort Smith. Large urban centers very different from 33 small communities that make up the rest of the territory. This was a barrier to consensus in the 18th Assembly. It caused the executive a proper understanding of the challenges of life in the small communities where most of us live. Places without all-weather roads, banks, daily air services, hospitals, full-time policing, or even decent foods. I am pushing for an executive that represents all parts of Northwest Territories so we can truly represent and serve our people in a genuine spirit of consensus. The October 1st general election has given the territory much to celebrate. It was conducted in a spirit of fairness and efficiency that 9/10 of the world's voters can only wish for. Most remarkable of all, women today occupy 50% minus one of the seats in this chamber. This milestone will have a lasting impact on policy decisions and outcomes of this government. It is an outcome that I welcome with all my heart. Finally, the election has delivered a crop of bright and committed MLAs representing incredible diversity, skills, talent, and experience. Amongst us, MLAs are experts in Indigenous governance, engineering, healthcare, media, law, climate change, business, social issues, each and everyone ready to make a difference in the lives of our constituents. The NWT deserves a premier who, through collaboration, will incorporate these diverse perspectives and experience into cabinet decision-making and lead us to serve the people of the Northwest Territories to the best needs of their needs. I am up for the task. I know that each of you is equally committed to collaborative tasks at hand as well. That's not to say that it will be an easy road. The challenges are very complex, critical to the well-being of our constituents. The challenges far outstrip the fiscal resources available to us. Furthermore, GNWT doesn't have exclusive jurisdiction over the Northwest Territories. We share governance with municipalities, the Constitution entrenched Indigenous governments, other Indigenous governments seeking settlement of their claims. The federal government also a crucial partner and primary source of revenue. The consensus principle applies to our dealings with these important players. With trust, patience, hard work, and right leadership, it can succeed in most difficult circumstances. In our priorities sitting on the table, MLAs discuss around economic prosperity. We all recognize that there's a need for economic diversification to build a northern economy. And there are many opportunities and tools to encourage development in our territory. This is just one key objective that we set for ourselves. All my experience in government administration and all my hard-earned political skill, I dedicate to delivering those priorities. I pledge that to you now. On specific issues, I pledge the following as Premier. I will ensure that GNWT supports with respect and integrity those Indigenous governments seeking settlements of their outstanding land claims agreement. I pledge to collaborate and cooperate with Indigenous governments to establish meaningful, equitable, and modern relationships. I will use my intergovernmental experience to strengthen our relationship with the federal government and to move them to a better understanding of our unique realities of Northwest Territories. I commit myself to improving the implementation of development strategies and the development of clear and more efficient regulatory process to encourage further investments and opportunities here in the Northwest Territories. I will support the enactment of mining regulations that respects the environment and our changing climate, do so in collaboration with all stakeholders, including Indigenous governments and business owners. To help diversify our economy, I will support business development, especially in small communities and with Indigenous governments. Targeted areas will include tourism, ecotourism, research and development, arts and culture, as well as development of infrastructure. I will work with communities to dissolve barriers to procurement and contracting and help strengthen our skilled labor force. I will ensure that the wisdom of our elders is taken into account in planning for climate change and that Indigenous knowledge has the same weight as science. Under my premiership, the GNWT will collaborate with federal government to ensure food security and reduce costs, especially in smaller communities. The communities will be involved. Food security includes agriculture and traditional harvesting. I promise that in Northwest Territories will continue to lead the country in reconciliation initiatives in the wake of the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the federal inquiry to missing and murdered Indigenous women. I have already led the way by creating mandatory modules, teaching the history and legacy of residential schools as part of the school curriculum. I will be a strong ally in language revitalization, including research and encouragement of youth to speak their Indigenous language. I pledge to work in close collaboration with the communities, with the Indigenous governments, the federal government, nonprofit groups to find viable solutions, such as Housing First, to the housing crisis that we face, especially in small communities, and especially respect to displaced and homeless people. I pledge my support for Polytechnic University, on par with institutions in the South. I want to encourage our post-secondary students, the graduates, to continue their higher education here in the Northwest Territories, to pursue their careers here in the Northwest Territories instead of taking their talents south. Respect health and wellness. I want to make sure that no Northerners are left behind. This means strengthening reconciliation efforts, supporting individual wellness in culturally relevant ways. It means better communication between departments, communities, and Indigenous governments. Ensuring no one is left behind means integrative, wraparound social service. It means supportive, innovative approaches like the Arctic Indigenous Wellness Foundation and FOXY and SMASH. It means restorative justice options, connecting elders and with the land. Ensuring no one is left behind means a greater focus on accessibility and affordability of early child care. Finally, ensuring no one is left behind means ensuring that services are in place for our seniors. for addiction treatments, and for our mental health clients. I pledge my heart to ensuring no one is left behind. It's not possible to catalog my responses to every issue we face. Time doesn't allow. But I am an excellent listener, and I have respect for different perspectives. If elected Premier, I commit to working as a team to explore all sets of issues or opportunities before making a decision. As we serve the people of Northwest Territories, we are reliant on the expertise of those who work in a public service. Our public service is a resource to be cherished and honored. It is a professional, skilled, and dedicated to the people of the Northwest Territories. This also applies to the unions, who work diligently to protect workers' rights and workers' welfare. As a Premier, I will provide leadership necessary to keep our senior government staff focused completely on the priorities set by this House. Under my premiership, senior staff will engage more with the people of the North in the communities. The same goes for Indigenous governments. I pledge to take an excellent, high-caliber civil service and within 4 years to make it even better. And by better, I mean titleship and greater efficiency. Deputies and assistant deputies will be required to search out and eliminate duplications and overlap. There are no other way if we are able to find the dollars needed to fund the priorities that we have set. The next 4 years presents an opportunity to both build on good work done by many people before us, as well as opportunity to work together to tackle issues we know our residents face today. The cost of living, health and wellness, education, employment, homelessness, food, income security, and the need to support the many northern families living with legacy of residential schools, and the results of the loss of Indigenous language and our culture. It is my goal in the next 4 years that people will be able to look back in 19th Assembly as a government that put collaboration and cooperation first, a government that worked together for the good of all people of Northwest Territories. It will be a government of strong, productive relationships with the communities, Indigenous governments, and Government of Canada. It will be a government in which Cabinet and regular members found a way to work closely together to produce the best programs and services for all Northerners. An NWT united behind a collective vision that leaves no one behind. If elected Premier, I promise every member's voice will be heard in this House. Every community will be represented. My priority is to build upon elders' concept of consensus government, to work together in a spirit of Denanawu, good intent for betterment of our people of Northwest Territories. I believe that if we work together in spirit of collaboration with all levels and departments within the governments, we can work in a true spirit of the drum, that we can achieve a better future, and that we can be a united voice and vision for the NWT.
If I am Premier, I promise every member's voice will be heard and every community will be represented. My priority is to build upon our elders' concept of consensus government. We are all here today with same vision for the North. Let's all work collaboratively together and achieve our common Northern goal. We will be like one people. We are all here to work in this chamber. Each one of us will present what we will want to work on. We will be working on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lafferty. Next.
Masi, Mr. Lafferty, Ms. Marcellos. Zoom members of
humbly put my name forward for your consideration as Premier. Although this is the first time here as an elected representative, I feel like our territory is at a crossroads with high levels of uncertainty about our economic and social future. I believe it is our duty as members of this Assembly to provide that certainty, some hope for all residents, that they have a secure future no matter what they do for a living, no matter which community they live in, and no matter what their personal circumstances are. I am here today to ask for your support because of my father, Frank Laviolette. After my mother passed away in 1995, I began spending more time with Big Frank. I was a businesswoman, and my husband and I were at a point where we were contemplating our own future. I had been a witness to my father's transition from bison rancher to politician. He established the first Aboriginal political organization in the NWT, attended Dene Nation meetings, and was instrumental in the political evolution of the Salt River First Nation. He started talking to me about Salt River affairs, but I originally wanted no part of it. As my sister pointed out to him, I was there to spend time with him because he was lonely. But my persistence comes from him. He was not going to stop suggesting I get involved. I started to see politics as part of my future, and in 2007, I got involved in the Salt River First Nation. In life, business, and politics, I've overcome adversity and challenges, realized opportunities, suffered loss, and experienced success. Though it was all I always believed in what I was trying to do, I believed in my vision of where I was going. And I believe now our territory needs a vision, building on the accomplishments of previous governments, but doing things in different ways. While there are proven ways to develop, implement, and evaluate government policy, I believe our residents want us to do new things in new ways. They don't want the status quo. We have elected 12 new MLAs, including myself, as proof. They want positive changes to move our territory forward with healthy people, a safe and pristine environment, and a thriving economy and a business community. Earlier in our deliberations, we outlined our priorities for this Assembly. We've been all entrusted with looking after the people, the environment, and the economy of the NWT. If chosen to be Premier, I believe one of our first priorities should be our Aboriginal people. The NWT is a leading jurisdiction in our country for recognition of Aboriginal rights. So I believe it's time for the Government of the Northwest Territories to fully endorse and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It is also time to settle outstanding Indigenous land and resources negotiations for the Acacho, the Detcho, and the NWT Métis as quickly as possible. We should also fight to have both reserves in the NWT recognized by Canada as federal reserves. We've heard from many leaders across the territory. The Government of the Northwest Territories is standing in the way of outstanding land claims. We have an obligation to truly walk the talk and seriously support the settlement of these claims in order to move forward. We shouldn't be an obstacle to settling these claims, and we should be actively moving to remove other obstacles to settling these claims. Settling Indigenous lands and resources negotiations will provide certainty for Indigenous governments to begin to draw jurisdiction down on self-governance, bringing programs and services closer to the people they serve, and economic opportunities if they chose to develop their lands and resources. We have all heard of the potential income and the huge positive impacts these agreements have on resource exploration in the NWT. The completion of these agreements would only bring certainty to industry, whether they are exploring on Indigenous lands or lands that are retained by the government. The health system in the NWT compares very favorably to that of other jurisdictions across the country. However, we need to make improvements by having doctors who live in the NWT and not simply dispense medical services as locums. In my home community, I've benefited on and off from seeing the same physician for extended periods of time. But we do need to do more to offer that level of service consistently to our residents. We must work together to support our healthcare workers and instill continuity in our health system so that our sick and elderly feel that they have a doctor that is their doctor, a doctor that knows them, that knows their medical history. Continuity will ensure our health system develops an environment of prevention. As statistics show, millions upon millions of dollars are spent on treatment. Monies could be saved by promoting healthy lifestyles for all residents. Money spent on prevention has huge returns on the health system and our society. I believe one of the wisest investments we can make as a government is in our children, setting the stage for their journey through life. We've all spoken about the importance of childcare to help our residents work and the positive impact this may have on our economy. Creating a universal subsidized childcare program is a must if we are to set the table for the people to work. Investing in early childhood development is the first and most essential building block in ensuring wellness and increasing our graduation rates. Offering post-secondary education opportunities in the NWT by supporting the plan to develop a Polytech University/University of the North is vital. When I was a child, there were many tradesmen in my hometown, the majority of which obtained their journeyman status right in Fort Smith. Currently, our territory suffers from a lack of qualified trades personnel. I believe it's time for us to re-examine the model that produced so many qualified tradespeople. The Polytech University would go to a long way in filling this void. We have an opportunity through the Aurora Research Institute to be a leading jurisdiction for the use, study, and sharing of the polar satellite data. Can we support and revitalize our connection to Aboriginal languages and traditional lifestyles through our university? We must work to ensure this is a truly unique university where people across the North, Canada, and other parts of the world will want to come to study. We have to work to improve how the government of the Northwest Territories addresses child and family services. Previous governments have examined how other jurisdictions provide services to children in care and looked at what is successful and what isn't. Implementation of the recommendations is essential if we are to improve the lives and the future of our children and families. Supporting our social workers and foster parents are important elements of working towards better service for children in care. But our goal should be to keep families together and reunited. We need to do everything we can to achieve this. avoiding children in care becoming statistics in the justice system, giving them better chances of becoming productive members of society. As Premier, I would like to look closely at the mandate of the NWT Housing Corporation. I see great potential to resolve many social housing issues we face across the NWT by allowing people who can afford to be homeowners to become homeowners. Only people who find themselves in a permanent, unfortunate situation should remain in social housing. We need to encourage and support others to transition into home ownership. In addition, the Housing Corporation should work to improve market housing across the NWT by providing incentives and programs which encourage homeowners to maintain and upgrade their dwellings. Pilot projects that support home ownership by leveraging third-party resources should be expanded. We know homeowners take pride in their property. Providing better housing overall for NWT residents should be the mandate of the NWT Housing Corporation. Across our territory, investing in infrastructure may be one of the most important investments the government of the Northwest Territories can make. Infrastructure has to be built in order to maintain our territory in good working order. However, we must look at each infrastructure project through socio-economic and environmental lenses in order to ensure positive impacts on our communities as we build our roads, schools, and health centers. We must plan to manage our debt to safeguard the next generation from the burden of unmanageable finances. We need to work with the Indigenous governments and the federal government to increase the speed in which money flows to our territory and to explore project funding models that leverage resources to get more projects done to support our communities and our economy. We hear lots of announcements of federal funding coming to our territory, but with very little impact on our infrastructure deficits. Federal funding are scheduled far into the future and are spread over many years. As your Premier, I would address this issue with the federal government as soon as possible. Expansion of the Tulsin River Dam is vital to the entire Northwest Territories. It will create a climate of new opportunities, countless new jobs, lower the cost of living and doing business in the NWT, and provide new training opportunities in the trades, giving new hope to the people of the Northwest Territories. We know that Aboriginal governments want to be involved in the Tulsin expansion from regulatory, environmental, and business opportunity perspectives. Let me touch briefly on the conservation economy. Recently, Thai Deni Nene was established in the east arm of the Great Slave Lake. This park, along with other parks and protected areas, offer many opportunities for our people to participate in the conservation economy. These new parks differ greatly from those of the past, as although they are there for all to enjoy, they guarantee traditional pursuits by those who have made use of the land since time immemorial. Continued support of the tourism industry is essential if we are to remain competitive with other jurisdictions and grow to encompass our new parks and other initiatives. Land management must be done in a partnership with our Indigenous people. We should share the land and work together so that our Indigenous partners don't see it as a government encroaching on their land. As your Premier, I believe we should place a heavy emphasis on supporting small business, Incentives provided to small business, such as tax breaks, business incentive policies, no collateral access to funding, and technological support will help small business succeed. We need to work together to expand tourism beyond the territorial capital and make sure our own northern operators are the ones benefiting the most from tourism. Small business is truly the way we can turn our economy around and put our people to work. The cost of living in the NWT is continually on the rise. Many of our families struggle to put food on the table. Energy costs can be staggering. Energy sources that reduce the cost of power can be an incentive to families to make their homes more energy efficient while reducing their carbon footprint. In addition, we in the NWT will be doing our share to combat climate change, which has harmful impacts on us. We only need to drive our highways and see the shoreline erosion in communities like Tuktoyaktuk to see the serious impact it has had and continues to have on our territory. My intention as Premier would be to visit all your constituencies so that I can hear firsthand what your constituents feel is needed to make the North a better place to live and improve their lives. I will ensure the ministers and deputy ministers visit your communities to meet with you and your leadership to raise their awareness about the issues currently facing you and collectively develop a plan to address concerns in the spirit of cooperation. Today I have risen to ask you to give me an opportunity to be your Premier. I feel I have the personal qualities required for a Premier of a consensus government: strength, compassion, and perseverance. Together, we are choosing political leaders for the government of the Northwest Territories for the next 4 years. No matter what the outcome, we are all the same team, doing what our residents want us to do, making the NWT a better place to live, work, and do business. I hereby commit to forming the necessary partnerships with all levels of government, Indigenous governments, local and federal governments, as well as the private sector, and also with all of you. From our deliberations since we were elected and here in this assembly today, I see a passionate group of MLAs who care. Solutions and decisions made here in the Legislative Assembly affect all people of the North. We have an obligation to the people of the Northwest Territories to set the stage for hope, cooperation, and equality. The people of the NWT deserve a government which is accountable and transparent, working collaboratively in the best interests. This is my pledge to you. Give me the opportunity to lead our collective efforts to make things better for all Northerners from Sax Harbor to Fort Smith. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Martselos. Finally, we'll turn the floor to Mr. R.J. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, over the past couple weeks, a number of people have asked my opinion on this new assembly. And the word that always comes to my mind is refreshing. There's a sense of renewal in the air, and a sense that we have the opportunity to finally start making the kind of changes that the voters in the last 2 elections have clearly demanded. In order to do that, we must first begin to address some fundamental issues that are at the heart of our ability to govern and our legitimacy as a government, including accountability, the functioning of consensus government, our relations with the public service, the public, other governments, and the relationship between the capital and the rest of the territory. These issues are the foundation of our decision-making process, and if we wish to make progress in the territory and advance a bold, long-term vision, then we need to start with a strong foundation. These issues, all of which lie squarely within the purview of the Office of the Premier, are what I will be discussing today. There are also a number of very important issues that I won't be discussing: economic diversification, healthcare, education, infrastructure, and so on. While I have definite opinions about what we need to do in regards to those areas, the priorities and goals of the next government will be determined by the Assembly as a whole when the elected 19 members meet next week. I'm not going to presume what those will be. What I'm going to talk about today are the changes I think need to come out of the Office of the Premier in order for this Assembly to achieve those goals. For those watching who may not be familiar with our system of government, the role and powers of the Premier in our consensus style of government differ from those in a party-based system. In a party system, a party's platform is developed independently from the legislature, and once elected, the Premier is given broad powers to implement that platform, including the power to appoint and remove cabinet ministers. In our system, the Assembly as a whole sets the priorities and has the sole discretion to appoint and remove ministers. This means that our Premier has less coercive power than provincial premiers and must therefore focus more on ensuring that there are strong working relationships between all members of the Assembly in order to get things done. In fact, relationships are central to the role of Premier. Relationships with ministers, regular members, Indigenous governments, the federal government, communities, industry, and the public. These are all interrelated, and if the Premier cannot maintain positive relationships with all of these entities, the effects are felt across our entire society. I've become quite familiar with these effects over the last 4 years. The union negotiations, the red alert, the pettiness seen in this Assembly, the discontent of the Indigenous governments that we heard yesterday in our meetings, and so on. And this is what spurred me to put my name forward for Premier. I don't want to disparage our current Premier. I believe that he has always acted with the best intentions of the territory in mind, and if I had an issue, I knew I could always walk to his office or pick up the phone, and he would be willing to talk. However, I think the territory will benefit from a new approach. People have lost faith in our system. They've lost faith in our ability to deliver results, and many people believe that the system is no longer fair. I can tell you that's how I felt, knowing that my vote never once mattered in the last Assembly. Everything was a done deal before it ever hit the floor. I don't always need to get my way. In life, you win some and you lose some. That's fine. I can accept that if the system is fair. What I won't accept is a situation in which a vote that is meant to represent the will of the people of Hay River is meaningless. That's unacceptable. We can do better. We need to restore people's faith in our system by ensuring everyone's vote counts and everyone's opinion is considered. There are lessons to be learned from the last Assembly, and regardless of who the next Premier is, they need to be addressed if we wish to serve the people of the Northwest Territories to the best of our collective abilities. The first issue that we need to address is accountability. This isn't just my opinion as a political insider. I hear this from members of the public all the time. We can start with the relationship between cabinet and regular members. As I stated, in our system of government, only the Assembly can appoint and remove ministers. In other jurisdictions where the Premier has this authority, it is clear that the Premier is ultimately responsible for the actions of ministers. However, in our system, the distribution of this authority could end up in a diffusion of responsibility, meaning when everyone is responsible for keeping ministers accountable, no one is responsible. I know at times I'm hard on the last Assembly, and perhaps I give the impression that it was all bad, but it wasn't. There were definitely some successes. There were some collaborative efforts that yielded excellent results. Unfortunately, if ministers showed no willingness to collaborate or displayed ignorance or arrogance or incompetence, there were no consequences or remedies available to us, and we all knew it. That is what needs to change. The power to remove ministers may lie solely with the Assembly, but that doesn't mean the Premier must wash his or her hands of that responsibility. The buck has to stop somewhere. If the leadership of this Assembly is lacking, it is up to the Premier to fill that void. I don't mean that the Premier should be able to remove ministers. I mean that the Premier should work to ensure that we never reach a point where we have to consider removing a minister. If there are problems with the minister's performance or attitude, the Premier needs to address it immediately. The Assembly and the public should expect as much and stand for nothing less. The responsibility that ministers have to the people of the Northwest Territories and their power to make decisions that can affect people's lives on a daily basis mean that we must be vigilant in assuring that they are performing their duties in accordance with a standard that the public finds acceptable. Of course, we don't live in a perfect world, and sometimes issues can't be resolved. If there are votes to remove ministers, such votes should never be subject to cabinet solidarity. If I were to become Premier, I would certainly do my best to hold ministers and the government to account, but what happens when I'm gone? It's not enough to put some new faces in the same old system and hope for the best. We'll never be able to design a perfect system that ensures accountability at all times, but we need to start implementing changes, codifying conventions, and creating expectations that will last beyond a single assembly. For example, in the report entitled Lessons Learned, the Special Committee on Transition Matters recommend that there be no less than 3 fireside chats per year. These informal meetings between regular members and the Premier are intended to address concerns before they become problems and have been proven to work well in the past. I think that we had 3 in the past 4 years, and by the time we did, it was too late. During session, there should also be weekly meetings between the Premier and the chairperson of the regular member caucus, known in the last Assembly as the Standing Committee on Priorities and Planning. These are the type of practices that need to become conventions. Although there were obvious personality conflicts in the last Assembly, I believe most problems resulted from a lack of communication. We need to open those channels, both formal and informal. I have to say I was astounded to learn that in previous assemblies, the principal secretary, the Premier's right-hand person, would regularly walk up and down the halls and speak with regular members and cabinet ministers to discuss issues or just get a sense of how everyone was doing. We never had that, but it should be an expectation. There's also room to improve the relationship and increase collaboration between cabinet and standing committees to the benefit of all our residents. We need to adopt the recommendations in the Lesson Learned report that would require the cabinet to consult with standing committees as well as the public at the beginning of the business planning and budget development process, in addition to the process that already exists, whereby standing committee is consulted when the documents are virtually complete and the opportunity to have any substantial impact on the government's plans has long passed. We must also adopt and codify some of the new collaborative methods of discussing potential policies and addressing issues with legislation that were pioneered in the previous Assembly. It might not sound novel, but by replacing protracted letter-writing campaigns in which each side would wait days or weeks for responses, with actual face-to-face meetings, we were able to get better results in a day than we otherwise would in a month. The Premier must also commit his or her government to working more closely with committees in regards to the timing and introduction of legislation. The work committees do is invaluable and directly affects the public's daily life in many cases. We must ensure that the committees have adequate time to do that work. Such coordination could also create time for more special committees to be struck. It was only late in the last Assembly that the potential for a special committee to examine the health system was discussed. Allowing for such work could have far-reaching impacts for the people of the Northwest Territories, and is another example of how Cabinet and regular members can collaborate for the benefit of the people. No discussion about accountability would be complete without a discussion of the bureaucracy. We all hear many complaints about how the bureaucracy are the ones really running the government, and the elected members are just along for the ride. We hear that from the public service, we hear that from the public, we hear that from MLAs, and from former ministers and premiers. I'll say it again, the buck has to stop somewhere. If the bureaucracy is running the show, the Premier must take responsibility for that. Maybe the most powerful tool that a Premier has is to appoint and remove deputy ministers. Either use it if you're facing problems, or step aside for someone who will. Now, I'm not saying that the next Premier needs to start handing out pink slips left and right, but he or she cannot stand for any obstruction or subversion of the public will as expressed through public representatives. That said, I don't look at the bureaucracy as the enemy. I figure I've met most of the GNWT senior management, and I have a lot of respect for them, and I honestly think they work for the benefit of the North. And I think I have a good relationship with most of them. Although sometimes it's a weird dynamic between MLAs and senior managers, but I think we get along. Ultimate authority and responsibility lies with the elected representatives, and I'm not going to use the bureaucracy as a scapegoat. Instead, I argue that we must better utilize the public service. As an MLA, I'm not supposed to talk to members of the public service about their work. However, we're a small jurisdiction and it's often unavoidable. I'm always struck by how often I hear the same two complaints over and over again, across departments and across regions. The first is that issues identified on the front line are rarely addressed. When policies are developed in Yellowknife, they might be well-intentioned, but they don't always roll out smoothly on the ground. When our frontline staff raise concerns about policy and recommendations to improve service delivery, we need to listen. We need a robust feedback loop that not only improves the service that we offer, but also shows respect to our frontline staff. The second complaint that I often hear about is that bold ideas and out-of-the-box thinking are stifled instead of encouraged. This has to change. We've lost a number of very good public servants for this very reason. Our vast, educated, and competent public service is the GNWT's greatest resource, and it's time that we treat it as such. We must also strive to make the GNWT's senior management more representative of our people. And this is an issue that during the business planning process we dealt with every single year. There are charts that show the number of Northerners in senior management, the number of Indigenous people in senior management, and the number of women, well, not the number of women, but we can see them when we're in those committee rooms. And there's a clear underrepresentation of both Indigenous peoples and women in the senior ranks, all the way up to the deputy minister level. And this assembly needs to change that. Not just talk about changing it, but I want to see real results. I want to see real equal representation of women and Indigenous peoples at the deputy minister and senior management level by the end of this assembly. One other important change I want to mention may not resonate with any of the new members or members of the public, but it's a change that I believe will finally begin to break down departmental silos and allow us to implement policies that are more responsive to our people and transfer the policy development power from the public service to the elected representatives. Those of us who have been regular members are aware of how invaluable committee support staff are. In particular, our research advisors have the seemingly impossible task of reading and analyzing all the documents received by committees and being able to provide members with information about how a particular policy or piece of legislation will play out or how it interacts with pieces of legislation from other departments or even other governments. I'm not exaggerating when I say that regular members could not do their job without that assistance. This staff works directly with and takes direction from the committees. I was genuinely shocked when I learned that Cabinet does not have a similar body to support them and aid in the development of policy. While there are policy positions within the departments, they are accountable to their deputy minister, not to Cabinet. There's no single body that can develop cross-departmental policies or strategies. The other day during a briefing, one of the new members asked a question that exemplifies why this is a problem. They asked about the immigration file and why it was split across two departments. The answer is because one department was focused on attracting investment and the other on bringing in workers. That put an end to the conversation, as it would at the Cabinet table. Instead of a single immigration policy, we have two that are independent from each other. End of story. Now imagine if we had a policy development unit that could actually look at this issue holistically, not from within a departmental silo. We could even include health and social services by once again looking at the possibility of attracting foreign physicians. We can include the executive so that they can help lobby Ottawa to increase the Northwest Territories' profile in Ottawa as a destination for immigrants. We could engage Aurora College to help address language or education deficits. This is just one example, and this is one of the critiques of consensus government, is that we don't have a robust way to develop policies the way party systems do, and this would help address that. Real-world issues rarely fit neatly into government silos, so we must address the structural issues within our own government that prevent us from breaking out of those silos, hinder program development, and maintain a bureaucratic barrier between policy and the elected representatives of the people. Earlier this week, the 19 of us met with Indigenous leaders from across the NWT. As was noted by many participants, it was an historic event, the kind that is virtually unheard of in other jurisdictions. Despite the fact that our government has a much more progressive relationship with Indigenous governments than do the provinces, it was clear from the discussions that there is still much frustration, and understandably so. The finalization and implementation of land claims and self-government agreements have stalled. The entire territory, all of us, will benefit from concluding unsettled claims and implementing agreements. And there is a general consensus that a new approach is needed to move forward. What does that approach look like? I'm not sure. but I'm sure that whatever it is will have to make people uncomfortable. The GNWT has spent far too long in its comfort zone. Nothing should be off the table. We want to go back to the table with fresh eyes and without the preconceived notions that have held us back. One of my colleagues made a comment yesterday that I thought was interesting. Instead of the GNWT in Canada presenting offers to Indigenous governments, perhaps GNWT and Indigenous governments should be presenting offers to Canada. That's the kind of relationship we need to strive for. We need to work together in partnership because, as was said time and time again at the meeting, we're stronger together. We also need to begin discussions about the future of the GNWT. And I've had this discussion with many of you. The GNWT is only 50 years old. What is it going to look like in another 50 years? We're a very unique jurisdiction. As we settle these claims and as we continue to implement self-government agreements, what will the role be for the government of the Northwest Territories in 50 years from now and 100 years from now? As communities begin to draw down programs, what should those programs look like? We need to start having this discussion because the programs that we design right now will be administered by Indigenous governments in the future. We need to implement the recommendations by the Standing Committee on Economic Development about the drafting of legislation and the inclusion of Indigenous governments. That report was specific to the devolution legislation, but as we heard yesterday, we need to possibly expand that to include other legislation that will affect the communities, legislation about education, legislation about health and social services. And this won't be easy. This won't be an easy sell. It is essentially giving up power, and that is not something that people like to do. But it goes hand in hand with the next issue I want to talk about, regional empowerment. It's something that's been called decentralization, but I don't like using that term because I've heard that term for a long time now, and that term hasn't yielded any results. When we look at services, when we look at new positions, it's always easy to come up with reasons why jobs, why services should be located in Yellowknife, instead of coming up with reasons why they should be located elsewhere. The immediate cost of keeping a position in the capital doesn't factor in a lot of the external factors, and that's something that we need to change. Going forward, this government needs to focus on how we can not just put a job in a community, but how we can move decision-making authority to a community. I know there are certain units where there might be 5 people, 3 are in Yellowknife, a couple are elsewhere. That doesn't really make sense. That's just moving a couple jobs. We need to take a different approach to this. And I found it interesting that a lot of the Yellowknife members actually brought this up, that when they went to the doors, there was a lot of concern about the economies in the small communities, because we all see that when there are low graduation rates, when there is poverty, when there are needs for housing, that affects all of us. There's only so much to go around, and right now, everything is centered in Yellowknife. Yellowknife has had one of the highest household incomes in Canada for 20 years, and there are other communities where the average income is $20,000, $30,000. Somehow we have to address this regional disparity. Finally, I want to talk about focusing on results. One of the criticisms that I've had, that many of us has had, that the public has had, is that the government is good at talking. It's good at producing piles of glossy documents that talk about what they're going to do, but we see very little action on it. The next premier, whoever that may be, needs to put an end to this. Creating documents, creating strategies shouldn't be an industry. This is the public money that we're using, and it needs to be used for the public good, not to keep people busy. There have been a lot of suggestions today. There have been a lot of good comments. There's been a lot of recognition of the need to improve relationships. And I just want to say, I hope that whoever becomes premier listens to all of the speeches today, because there were good elements that need to be incorporated. We need to work together going forward. And so if I'm premier, I'm happy to work with the other members and incorporate their ideas. And if I'm not, I hope that we can still work together and make our system of government, make our legislature more functional and and provide more prosperity for the people of the Northwest Territories. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson, and thank you to all four candidates for Premier for keeping your comments within the timeframes that you'd agreed to. Very well done indeed. Right now, we'll take about a 15-minute break. We'll reconvene at about 5 to 11, where we'll commence our question and answer period. So we will adjourn right now until 5 to 11. Thank you. Good morning, members. We'll reconvene the first meeting of the Territorial Leadership Committee. The four nominees for Premier have now made their speeches, and we will now open the floor to questions. As you have earlier agreed, each member is entitled to ask each of the Premiers 2 questions each. Once you ask your question, I will proceed to put the question to each of the 4 candidates in no particular order. So I may start with one candidate at one point and bounce it around a bit. We may not necessarily follow alphabetical order. I think we'll follow alphabetical order for the first one and then switch it up for the second one. I'm not going to maintain a list, members, so after each question is asked, I'd ask that you please try and get my attention first to ask your questions. So that having been said, members, I'll open the floor now to questions. Are there any who wish to ask a question? I will start with Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair and candidates, as you are aware, the riding you represent have 5 small communities and a regional center. Can you please tell me and everybody here how you, as a Premier, will do a better job of hearing the small communities' voices and concerns and improve their quality of life? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I'll first start with Ms. Caroline Cochrane. Ms. Cochrane, you have 5 minutes on the clock. Extra points if you finish before then. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To hear the voices of small communities and all communities actually is critical. One of the methods that we have is actually to be, as elected members of the Legislative Assembly, we all carry the opinions, the voices of our people. We need to work better with the regular members and work towards listening to them better and working closer together in addressing those issues. But also there was a disconnect, and I think that Cabinet in itself as Premier, if elected as Premier, I commit that actually we will be going into communities more often, and not only Cabinet alone, but as a Premier as well. I did watch how Prime Minister Trudeau actually goes in and actually sits and has the people around him. And I think that that is the right way, is actually that we need to reach out more, we need to be accessible to our people. As Cabinet, as a Premier, we represent all people in the Northwest Territories, not only one riding, not our own riding at all. So we need to be accessible, and we can't hear them unless we're actually with them. So we need to focus more on providing more visits to every community, to every riding in the Northwest Territories over the next 4 years. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Cochrane. Lots of bonus points for that one, for sure. Next, I'll go to Mr. Lafferty.
Merci, Mr. Clerk. Mr. Clerk,
we live in the small communities, and it's very important for us, and our community members have told us many times that we are always doing a lot more for the larger communities, and I've heard this many times before. So when I look at it, if we are to move forward, we have to work closely together. There's all the MLAs here. We have to all come together and make sure that we express our concern right away and support one another. We have to figure out how we can work together and solve the issue that we are working on. Whose community are we supporting? So we can't just do it alone. If there's new ministers, all the ministers, they have to also come to the communities. The new ministers have to go to the communities. If the people see you all the time, they will come to know the ministers and how they work, and they can work together with the members. We have to collaborate together, which should be first for us. There's 19 members here. We have to get together and work together. And here in this chambers, we're going to be here tomorrow. we have to always mingle and work together and have meetings together. We have to ask each other, how is your community? How are you doing? We have to have a lot more communication. And I know that we're not always going to agree with each other, but we are representing people, and we have to work on the people's issues. I think it should be that way, but 19 members have to support one another. I realize there's a question here. I'm willing to work with all the members that are sitting here. I will speak to you, and you are going to end up working with me. I realized in the past sometimes that the members before the assembly before did not work as well. I heard that in the community, so we're going to have to change that and work more together. So I'm really glad that I was asked of me the question. If we have a concern, we have to put it on the table and talk about it. Or somebody else would say, there's an issue here at this community. Let's all go to the community and support this person. That's what I would do. Thank you.
Mussey, Member Lafferty. Next, I have Ms. Martselos.
I ran on the mandate of stronger communities and stronger regions. People of the NWT want proper services in the small communities, and I feel that we have to meet that mandate. A lot of our regional centers have been there's been jobs have been pulled out of those regional centers, and they have to be reinstated. And I feel that when you have a strong regional center at that level to serve the smaller communities in your region, everybody is happy. There has to also be a connection between the government that elected them and the government that serves them. I feel that there has been a disconnect. It's obvious, and from some of the complaints that we even saw yesterday. And I think that there is a gap, and the gap has to be filled, and we have to fill the gap. We are all elected to do that, and that's what we expect. And we expect the people that work in deputy minister levels and any part of the bureaucracy to also fill that gap on our behalf. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Martselos. Finally, Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, one of the biggest things I realized when I came to this assembly is that, even though I'm from Hay River, we have KFN close by, Enterprise, Kikiza, these communities that aren't that remote. They're connected on the road system. I didn't really know that much about them. I was quite ignorant despite spending so many years so close to them. And I learned a lot from the people I worked with, the members I worked with. And so I think that there's a few layers that you can use in order to hear from people in the communities. There's no substitute for actually being on the ground in the community. And so I agree, I'm not going to ignore a good idea just because it came from some of the other contenders, but getting into the communities is a good idea. There's no substitute for it. And not just in and out on a charter, in the morning, out in the afternoon. I think that there needs to be some time spent in the communities. Another way to hear from the communities is listen to the member from who represents that region. I know that it was frustrating for me as a member from outside Yellowknife to try and get things across to some ministers who, it's almost like they didn't believe you. So I understand that we have to take it seriously when these concerns are brought by the members. I also talked in my speech about a feedback loop where the government employees on the ground who are delivering the frontline services, who know communities, can get information back to the decision makers. So, how do we hear from the GSOs, from the social workers, from the health nurses, what's going on in the community? We need to establish some sort of communication channel like that. And even meetings like we had yesterday with the Indigenous leaders, more like that. Even When guys here are here in the Great Hall, just coming to watch the proceedings, I like to go and chat with them. You know, if it's someone I met in Trout Lake, ask how their community garden is doing, or things like that. You know, there's an effort on each of our own parts as well, in addition to the government-wide effort, but we each have to educate ourselves as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. I'll open the floor now to another question. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, at meetings with Northern leaders yesterday, we heard that their priority is finalizing land rights and self-government agreements and implementing existing agreements. Many advocated for the GNWT to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. In other words, to adopt a new approach to negotiations. They see implementation as a way to repair what they describe as a broken relationship with the GNWT and complete stall at the negotiating tables. My question for the candidates is, do you support the implementation of UNDRIP by the GNWT? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. I'll begin with Ms. Martselos.
Well, that's a perfect question for me. I was on the Indigenous file since 2007, and I understand completely all the obstacles that seem to be in the way of an implementation of a claim. I agree with the adoption and implementation of the UN Indigenous
Indigenous people.
Yeah, for Indigenous people. I really believe in that because, you know, the implementation of even of a claim is, like, it's been 17 years with Salt River. Okay, 17 years that, and we still don't have recognition as a reserve within Canada. We do not have the O&M capacity and infrastructure that the other reserves across Canada have, just because we're north of 60. So I think it's extremely important that we do all the things that came out of the meeting yesterday, because I felt that I was part of the meeting even though I didn't say anything. And it's extremely important that each and every one of us pass the, I keep on forgetting the name because I don't have it in front of me. The government of the Northwest Territories to fully endorse and implement the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Absolutely.
Next, I'll go to Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have no problem implementing the articles of UNDRIP. My concern is that while we heard a lot of support for implementing UNDRIP, we also heard a lot of support for certainty, and to stand up and say we're going to implement this blanket international document creates a lot of uncertainty for people. I think that I would prefer to go to each table, to talk to each leader, say what is the issue, what part of this are we not implementing, what can we do better, and live up to the actual spirit and intent of it, as opposed to just say, okay, let's do it. What does that mean? I'm not clear what that means. Legal scholars don't know what it means. I would rather just do the work to actually get the claim settled, to actually live up to the articles of it, than to make a statement like the 16th Assembly did that really didn't amount to much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Next, I'll go to Mr. Lafferty.
Merci, Mr. Chair. From yesterday's meeting with Aboriginal leadership across the Northwest Territories. And they've identified that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, obviously the federal government has it on there.
Katie, and yes,
Spirit and intent of this such agreement. I, for one, would like to engage more with the communities, the leaders, where they're going with this. And I'd like to engage them and hear their perspectives. We just heard the tip of the iceberg yesterday, and I'd like to hear more from the communities and also from the regular members as well, before we proceed to develop such an agreement from this House, I want to engage the general public on this particular piece of work. Merci.
Merci, Mr. Lafferty. Finally, Ms. Cochran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if we're going to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, I'm total agreement. In fact, the government of the Northwest Territories endorsed that move on 2008. But it's not only the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous People. We have the Truth and Reconciliation also that we need to consider, and the inquiry on the missing and murdered Indigenous women. These are all serious pieces of research that have been done, suggestions, and we need to work towards implementing all of them in a true spirit, not to just say that we are endorsing it, but actually move forward. I truly believe in self-determination, I believe in self-government, and I believe that we need to be able to offer our services not to tell Indigenous governments this is how you do it, but to say we're here if you need support. We will help you if you need tools, if you need advice, whatever you need to be able to actualize self-determination and self-government. I think it's key to moving forward, to becoming better governance, and to actually meeting all the needs of all the people in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Cochran. So you all get bonus points for being well under your time on that one, so they cancel each other out. Next, I'll open the floor to questions. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the last sitting of the legislature, it was apparent to those outside government that the Premier and Cabinet used a model of Cabinet and three friends to make decisions for the NWT. This was further confirmed by the Premier during an interview. This practice not only alienated the remaining MLAs in the decision-making process, but it further excluded the people they represent, which is totally unacceptable, when what we need is inclusion and not exclusion. Mr. Chair, the question I'm going to pose comes from a resident of Hay River. The question is, if elected Premier, how would you do things differently to prevent Cabinet from perverting the consensus model of government by using the Cabinet and three friends model used by the Premier of the 18th Legislative Assembly? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. The order for this question will be Mr. Lafferty first, Mr. Simpson second, Ms. Marcellos third, and Ms. Cochran fourth. Mr. Lafferty.
Merci, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I believe what's done in the...
When you look at that, it's very important. As you noticed yesterday and last week, we spoke about this issue. And yesterday, a lot of leaders came and talked to us and gave us their own views. And right now, there's not very good communication. Right now, we have a consensus government. It's three people and that work together to make decisions. But here, if I am a Premier, I will work with all the members. I know that we will agree on some and not agree on some, but we have to support, hold on to each other and support each other in order to meet with the federal government or with other, and also other self-government people and also other groups. Sometimes, sometimes we don't always agree on things. That has happened in the past, and I wish it wouldn't happen. Right now, one of the members from Hay River spoke. I agree with him. How can we work more together and move forward? I know we can't always agree on everything, but we have to listen to each other. When someone is speaking, I want to listen. I realized yesterday there's a lot of people that spoke, want us to resolve a lot of these issues from the past, and they want us to work with many different governments. So I want to support that. If there is some issue, And we have to go to our MLA or our elected member and say, this is my issue. We have to listen. Even though we don't always agree on the same issues, or we have different opinions, we have to listen and try to resolve, especially when we're sitting at the table with the federal government. So we have to listen to each of our concern, and that's the way we can move forward. Thank you for the question. Merci, Mr. Lafferty. Mr. Simpson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this was the crux of my speech earlier. I spoke about a number of things. First of all, there's always going to be an element of benevolence in any form of, in any democratic system. You have to trust that the leader won't take the easy way out. And so I put a lot of thought into how can we completely eliminate that, and you can't. So you do have to trust your leader. I think there are some things we can do, though, like I mentioned, codifying, having fireside chats, so that issues don't become problems. Requiring regular meetings between the chair of P&P and the premier, so that issues aren't left to fester. And the communication is the problem. There's a communication breakdown, and one side didn't know what the other side was doing, and people thought the worst. And people decided, instead of having to deal with that, let's just not deal with that. And I think that we need to create an expectation on how we're supposed to govern. And that's what I was encouraging all the members here today to do. Expect something from your premier. We need to go forward with an expectation that the +3 model does not work. And in parliamentary systems, if something happens long enough, it becomes taboo. And that's what we need to make happen. We need to make a concerted effort so that every time a new assembly comes in, the idea of +3 is off the table, because it's bad governance and everyone's aware of that. And I think this needs to be an ongoing process. I throw out a few ideas, but I'd like to see, as we learn things, that we begin implementing those as well. Consensus government isn't that old. It's a relatively new style of government, the type we're using, and it's still growing, and we need to adapt it when challenges arise. And this was one of those challenges, and we need to adapt and overcome. And if there's changes now we can implement, great. If 2 years on we see that, here's another issue, here's another way we can fix this issue, let's implement that as well. It shouldn't just be the beginning of an assembly and then we're done with it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Next, Ms. Marcellos.
I strongly believe that a good leader listens and is approachable and also has an open door policy. Building relationships and making sure that everybody is inclusive is extremely important. We are all newly elected people here. My door will always be open. You don't have to be a cabinet minister to come and see me. And we build relationships with other people outside of this house and partnerships that will last forever. We will not agree on everything. And if we don't agree on everything, we leave it at the door. You got to be able to leave things at the door. If you're going to take it outside of the door, you have problems. I've been through a lot in my leadership and learned a lot of qualities of good leadership. Everybody should leave the room with a smile and be happy when they leave the room, no matter if we don't agree. Because we're not going to agree on everything. But I know that building a relationship with all of you would be a priority. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Marcellos. Finally, Ms. Cochran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've said many times in this House, and in fact I've been kind of criticized in the media for saying, and I think I still maintain it, that I'm humble enough to say that I'm not the expert in everything, and that together as a team we make better decisions. So I believe in that better decision making is not only around the way we operate and how we do our relationships, it's about policy development and how we do legislation. I didn't like the 3-vote idea. I never walked down the hall and got 3 specific votes, but I did walk down the hall. And I looked for support from all MLAs that would support me, and that's normal practice, and I think that's good practice. I also feel I worked really well with standing committee, and mostly with social issues, because that's the standing committee I went to. So I changed kind of the format, and I'll talk about Polytech for a minute. Usual procedure is that you go to cabinet, you get authorization, you kind of have a game plan, and then you go into standing committee, and then you accept the changes or not, and then you fight it on the floor. I worked with our standing committee chair at the time, and we came to agreement that instead of doing that, I would go to standing committee first, take their input, change the presentation, then take it to cabinet for their approval, and then go back to standing committee. I thought that was a great example because the Polytechnic University, when I announced that this house was accepted, it wasn't slaughtered all over the floor like junior kindergarten was previous to that. So I think that we need to stop as cabinet cramming legislation down people's throats. I don't think that's appropriate. I think we need to stand back, and if we don't get legislation passed, it means that we as cabinet did not do a good enough job, and we have to take ownership of that. So we either pass legislation that is agreed on by majority, because as everyone has said, not everyone will agree, but the majority needs to, and if it's not passed, we need to accept that and work harder at making it. So it's about relationships, and we need to respect that all of us have expertise, and all of us together will make the best decisions for all residents of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Cochran. I'll open the floor again to questions. Mr. Johnson.
Cabinet solidarity exists in virtually every parliamentary system, but also in every parliamentary system there are exceptions, and free votes are often allowed on key issues. I believe this model of cabinet plus 3 friends really gets down to the issue of cabinet solidarity. Are you, as Premier, willing to allow exceptions to cabinet solidarity, and in what cases would you allow that?
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. The order for responding this time will be Mr. Simpson, Ms. Cochran, Mr. Lafferty, and Ms. Martselos. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, and as I alluded to in my statement, cabinet solidarity, I don't think it should be required for votes of confidence in a minister. I have to think, I might have to take that on notice and get back to the member when it comes to other circumstances, because I recall in the last assembly there were some times when I questioned why cabinet was voting as a block when it really didn't seem like it was necessary. So yeah, I'm open to those kind of changes. Those are the kind of evolutionary changes that we need to see with consensus government in order to increase accountability and in order to let the public know that this is not, it's not a dictatorship. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Even though the question's been taken as notice, I'm going to continue to put it to the other candidates. Ms. Cochran, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Cabinet solidarity is an issue, but it's necessary in some cases because we can't have anarchy, and we need to be working together as a government. But I do think that we need to look at a 3-tier system, actually a system that looks at low risk, for example, things like picking out cabinet ministers if they're up for evaluation. Is that a risk to the government as a whole? And if not, then we should be opening up that vote for cabinet minister to have a free vote. We need to look at medium risk. If there's a risk and we're not sure, then I think cabinet as a whole needs to define that, not just the premier, and say, can we stand on our own, or do we need to vote in solidarity? If there's, and the highest risk, if there's integrity, if it jeopardizes the integrity of this system, of this institution, at that point, I do believe that cabinet solidarity has to be in place. But I do think that instead of it being ad hoc and deciding at the moment, which I experience, we need to decide that as soon as we sit as cabinet members and decide at what point we would be looking at solidarity and when we can't. Because I do think that there were a lot of times that open vote would have been appropriate, and it was hard to not have that option. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Cochran. Mr. Lafferty.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Chair, cabinet solidarity exists for a reason, and there are times where a very sensitive issue is brought up or how it's going to benefit the North, and so obviously in the past it's been case by case, but majority of the decisions that were made in solidarity, a lot of decisions were made forming a solidarity, and I think as we move forward, Mr. Chair, we have members in this House with bright ideas and expertise going forward. Obviously, we need to listen to them and have an open communication dialogue. If there's a motion that's coming down and they feel that it should be open vote as opposed to solidarity, then I will listen to them and say, okay, well, we can probably pursue it, but at the same time, there will be repercussions at the government level. So I have to be careful on how to deal with that. So those are the discussions that we need to have. In former government, we didn't really have that, from what I've seen sitting in the speaker's chair. So I, for one, will be open to listening to members and accepting if there needs to be a free vote, then if I get the support from members, then I'll do that. But at the same time, there will be solidarity votes on certain programs and motions. So there is a reason for it as well. Masi.
Thank you, Mr. Lafferty. Ms. Martselos.
I think cabinet solidarity is important, but I also feel that transparency and accountability is also important. So I think that there's always exceptions to the rule. In every case, no matter in which life you live, there's always exceptions to the rule or to policy. So I would make sure that the MLAs are heard, and I would listen to them, and then go back to cabinet and discuss that concern and come back with a decision of cabinet if we are going to have an open vote on a particular item. That's the way I would handle it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Martselos. Next, I'll go to Ms. Knockleby.
So I'm going to ask about infrastructure. No shock. So our debt is currently sitting at $1.1 billion, and we have a cap of 1.3, so that doesn't really leave us a lot left. So I have sort of a twofold question. How do you plan to raise the necessary capital to conduct the proposed infrastructure projects, such as the roads in Tulston, if that's the way that we move forward as a government? As part of that then too, I'd like to know what you're going to do to ensure that that work and those projects, including the giant mine remediation project, that work goes to Northern and Indigenous businesses as much as possible and is used to build capacity within the territory.
Thank you, Ms. Knockleby. The order we'll follow this time will be Ms. Cochran, Ms. Martselos, Mr. Simpson, and finally Mr. Lafferty. Ms. Cochran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I stated in my speech that we are going to have to make some tough decisions in this government. We are closing. We're 1.1 billion and our cap is at 1.3. It's a serious issue. We have programs that we need to evaluate. We need to look at them if they're still efficient, if they're still meeting the needs of the priorities of this government, previous governments. But we also have programs that we need to bring in to be able to address people, and we do have capital needs. So traditionally, the federal government actually on large infrastructure projects actually gives up to 75 cent dollars, and we have to come up with 25%. We have used our short-term borrowing or looking at monies internally to do that. It is in the best interest of people, and so we move forward with that. But work in the North is critical. And I have seen that with many of our infrastructure projects. So why would we even bring infrastructure projects into the Northwest Territories if all of the work is going south? And because all the spending goes south then. That does not make sense to me. So I'm not sure if it's about the projects are too big and the capacity of northern businesses, but if that is the issue, then maybe we need to break up those projects and look at smaller projects so that northern businesses can have an advantage with that. I also think our BIP process is not working for people, and we need to look at that. I know it's a 30%, and it sounds really good when you say 30% advantage, but something's not working in it, and so we need to have flexibility within that business incentive program, and we need to actually revise it so that the jobs and the resources and the monies stay in the north. Otherwise, we're just wasting our time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Cochran. Ms. Martselos.
I bring a very strong business acumen to this House. I've been in business for the last 45 years or more. And I think that there are other creative ways of looking at the deficit. I think that capital dollars are not being used and could be put to use in a different way. Because we're dealing with a lot of Aboriginal communities that have access to different means within the federal government way or also within our own Aboriginal organizations that have been developed across Canada. There is one in particular that I want to give you an example of. The First Finance Authority that has been developed that uses leverage for building capital expenditures at a 2% rate and over a period of time, and they're able to you're able to get the dollars on 2%, and that is unbelievable. And you are able to do it over a period of time. And if we go into an agreement with them for our communities that are mostly Aboriginal, there are lots of creative ways of using those capital dollars in a different way. We've done that in Fort Smith with Salt River. There are other things that I think that have to be looked at. We have to evaluate all the departments and see where the overlap is. I think that we have to start doing things creatively. I think that also that it's extremely important, very important, that all our businesses in the North have got to be considered first before any of the contracts, tenders, or anything else is ever considered to go south. We have to be able to look after the business community and everything, all the resources in the Northwest Territories the way it should be, because it's not. And that's why people in our communities are upset, because they're not being able to access many of these larger contracts. We should also make sure that the Indigenous communities that have corporations that do this type of work are also considered. It's extremely important that we also make sure that the whole community and the whole business area of it is looked after together, because it's extremely important that we all benefit from that. When our own communities are benefiting, it's the whole community benefits, the whole Northwest Territory benefits, and that's the way the economy has to flow in order for us to get out of this deficit.
Thank you, Ms. Martselos. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. I've spoken on this issue a number of times in the House. The $1.1 billion debt that we have, we're approaching the limit, and we need to go to Ottawa and make the case that we need that increased. And we need to make a compelling case, and the case that I always try to make is that the Government of Canada built the Trans-Canada Highway, they built a railroad from east to west, but they never came north. And so we still need those nation-building infrastructure investments, and we need the money to do it. I understand they're hesitant to to up our limit. You know, they're the backstop. Nonetheless, those funds are needed. In terms of keeping money in the north, it's another thing that's close to my heart. I've spoken about this a number of times. P3 projects, you know, we have the hospital, and that was being built when we started our term here, and we were given a presentation. We were shown a list of all the different local businesses that were benefiting from it, and then you run into one of those local business owners in the street, and they say, well, we didn't get anything, or, you know, we got you know, a couple bucks here or there, but there was no real the money that stayed here. And you hear stories about people flying in to do the drywall and then flying out. There needs to be northern content in P3s. There's no two ways about it. These are massive infrastructure projects using public money, then they have to benefit northerners. In terms of smaller infrastructure projects, there are a lot of ways that we can increase northern content. Sometimes in the South Slave especially, and I assume in Yellowknife as well, there are some contracts that might be $10, $15, $20 million. Maybe a northern company can't do that. Can they do $4 or $5 million contracts over a longer time? Maybe. We need to start looking at things like that as well. This is low-hanging fruit when it comes to keeping money in the north. I know that myself and one of the other members always point out it was a $12 million contract that went south for 3%. 3% total. And that money just flowed over the border, and that's unacceptable. This is something that the Standing Committee on Economic Development looked into in procurement because we weren't getting any traction. And I think that that's a good starting point to start looking how to make changes in the next assembly. And there's other interesting ways to do it as well. I think that we need to put together, we need to do a better job consulting with industry on how to keep money in the north. That's one thing that we just don't do. We need to go, and you know what, it's hard sometimes to talk to small business owners and industry. They're busy. The last thing they want to do is talk to the government, especially when the last 50 times they talked to the government, nothing happened. So we need to make sure that industry and small businesses know that they're being heard and they can see results from those consultations. There's a lot we can do, and that's one of the things I look forward to doing in the next assembly. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Lafferty.
Mr. Clerk. Mr. Clerk, good night.
If there is major development in the Northwest Territory, everyone talks about it, especially capital, whether it's a hospital or a school. It's up to the government. As a government and the federal government, we need to work together. And there's some responsibility that falls under the territorial government and federal government, and we need to work together in that way. And the member from Hay River also mentioned this. We need to open our doors to each other, and we need to also take their advice, and that's the only way to go forward. Not only that, but like yesterday when we met with the northern leaders, there were some elders that were there as well, and they did say to us, as small communities, we don't benefit in a lot of ways. So as we, the MLA around this table, we need to make that as a priority, and we're starting to talk about it last week and this week as well. And we need to submit this to the federal government. Whoever is the premier will take that message to the federal government. If we don't talk for ourselves, we won't get anything done. Even there's a person from the Satu region that said that how they wait for the government to make a decision, and everything falls behind, and they said finally they've decided to start to go ahead on business on their own. When we look at all this in the Northwest Territories, a lot of the Aboriginal government, we need to open our doors to them and work closely with them. We have government, federal government funding, territorial government, like the 3P projects. We can work well together easily in that way. When we look at the Northwest Territories, we need to take a good look at our resources and how we can all help each other and work with each other. Today, we have a hospital, a new hospital that we spent $300 million, and we need a lot of our people working there. Even right here, Bichacombe, my community, we need more of our people working in these positions. We're always hiring from the south. And when we look around, we see a lot of non-Dene people working in our community. So we need to change that as well. And the way we handle the contracts, we need to hire our people, train our people. We need to include that as well. Also, the BIT program is not working well. And when a contract is given, they're given a certain percentage. And this member from Hay River was on that, and I'm thankful for him for giving that information. He doesn't agree with the BIT program as well. We need to change that policy. I think that's the only way we're going to see changes in the Northwest Territories. So it's up to us as individual, as a government. We need to change those policies. So what are we afraid of? This government is going to change after today. We need to face our people and get their advice as well. We heard, I think it's important that we hear the communities as well. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lafferty.
Masi,
Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I have a question to pose to all the possible premiers here. Once elected as premier, how will you ensure that our economic chapters of our Gwich'in and Inuvialuit land claims are honored when it comes to negotiated contracts? Over the last number of years, it seemed that some departments were reluctant to negotiate certain contracts with my constituents, while in the past, our government used to negotiate up to 50% of the total cost of contracts in my riding. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. The order will follow this time will be Ms. Martselos, Mr. Lafferty, Ms. Cochran, and Mr. Simpson. Ms. Martselos.
If it's in your agreements, then it should be honored. I really believe that many times there's certain things that are put into agreements, and the actual implementation by any government, whether it be territorial or federal, are never honored. And I truly believe that they should be honored.
Thank you, Ms. Martselos. Mr. Lafferty.
Masi.
We have, as a government, we are the government. If you are settled with a self-government agreement, you are considered a government. I'm sure that we can review that. And we have a lot of economic development and businesses in our community. Sometimes those contracts are not given to the community, but we also have negotiated contract as well. So we have to give opportunities to the communities, and we're not doing that. Sometimes our departments, when they look at all the paperwork, even for example, the Clinton self-government are considered government. Chapter 26 states this in their constitution. So it also states in there how negotiated contract will be in place. When we talk about this, they always say that we're not able to do this and that. But when you take a look at it as a whole, we need to review some of these policies that are in place, that were already in place. but some since 1992, 2005, some of them have already self-government in place. Some have Aboriginal government in place, and they have these in their agreement. Us, as the government of Northwest Territory, put our name in there, on that agreement, and we agreement. But now we're saying no to their agreements. We need to have an open mind and fresh eyes to review this, that's the agreements that's already in place. Even here, my friend, what is he talking about? And we need to take a good look at it and carefully. As ministers and MLAs, we all need to take a good look at it. I'm sure that we can review this. Right now, I'm seeing there's no changes, but the administration tell us that we could do this and cannot do this. But we, as the elected MLA, need to listen to our communities. I'm thankful for his question, and he knows what's going on in the communities, and I see that myself in my community, and he's speaking up for his community. We need to make some changes enable to for things to change in the community. We have 4 years that we can make changes, and we are supposed to be giving our staff directions, not the administration telling us what to do. Thank you.
Merci, Member Lafferty. Next.
Merci. Ms. Cochran?
I'll start by saying if we have agreements in place, we need to honor our agreements. And if we're not honoring our agreements, then we should be held to task for that. That's not okay. But it's more than just the agreements for me. So I know that in the last 4 years as a cabinet minister, we've talked about negotiated contracts quite a bit. Some ministers said no negotiated contracts is fair, and other ministers said as many as possible. We need to be careful with that. So I don't believe in negotiated contracts with private businesses, in all honesty. I believe, though, in negotiated contracts with Indigenous and community governments because I believe in community development. So it's not only about the Indigenous governments that have agreements, it's about building the capacity of all Indigenous governments so that they can actually become on the path towards self-government. And it stays in the community. If you support a negotiated contract with an Indigenous government, that money stays within their community, it stays in their region, and they tend to hire their own workers. I have seen exceptions when they didn't have the expertise and they had to go into jurisdictional, but they tried to keep as much in their community as possible. So again, if we're really taking this truth and reconciliation about the UNDRIP, about self-determination, about self-government, then we need to be willing to open the doors to support our Indigenous governments so that they can succeed as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Cochran. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. Yeah, it's patently wrong to just to ignore an agreement. We had meetings with Indigenous leaders yesterday, and one of the comments was that the employees of the GNWT, at least the senior management or the people who deal with Indigenous governments, should be familiar with the agreements and the content of the agreement. And I think that's an excellent policy, and I think moving forward it's something we need to implement, because to just ignore something that is written and so obvious, that's just plain wrong. Negotiated contracts have fallen out of favor in the last government, it seems. The government was very concerned about their bottom line. They didn't want to spend a penny more than they had to. It doesn't mean, or it didn't matter if that meant that the money would flow out of the territory. I know in the South Slave, when there's a negotiated contract, what often happens is that if there's work to be done near a community, the company will go to the community and say, and talk to the chief and council and say, what can you do for this project? Are people looking for work? What can you offer? And so it's more than just a company getting money in many cases, even when it's a private company. We need to start looking at the benefits of keeping money in the territory on a larger scale in terms of negotiated contracts. But when it comes to following the letter of an agreement, that's a no-brainer. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. We have time for one more question before we take a lunch break, and I'll offer the final question of the morning to Ms. Wozniak.
Mr. Chair. I think over the last 2 weeks, almost everyone in this room has recognized the importance of our vastness and our different geography and how important it is that we see ourselves as united. It's clear that if one region or one community is failing, that we are all going to be struggling. But I'd like to ask this morning where you see our capital city fitting into your vision for the future of the Northwest Territories.
Thank you, Ms. Wozniak. The order this time will be Mr. Lafferty, Ms. Cochran, Mr. Simpson, and finishing with Ms. Martselos. Mr. Lafferty.
Merci. Mr. Chair, we service 33 communities in the Northwest Territories, and the City of Yellowknife is part of that, and the regional centers in the communities, and also the other isolated communities. And we have to include Yellowknife as well. There's a City of Yellowknife that we need to work with. There's Dene communities, YK Dene that we have to work with. They're just our neighbors in Yellowknife as well. So those are important groups that we need to work with. And other communities as well. As we've heard yesterday, clearly from Aboriginal leadership, that they want us to focus on infrastructures in their communities. And at the same time, we have to prioritize where is those infrastructure is much needed. Whether it be a school burned down in one of the communities, obviously that will be a first priority. And when there's the gymnasium that's being built in Yellowknife, that does take time to negotiate with the federal government. I've been through with the education minister of the day. And so some projects takes time, but at the same time, we have to balance all communities as much as possible. At the same time, we've heard from leadership yesterday that everything funnels through the City of Yellowknife. But at the same time, we have to be open-minded. Any projects that come to the table, what is the benefit of the communities? Not just the City of Yellowknife, but surrounding communities. I have a community that's close to Yellowknife, Bishopcombe. How is Bishopcombe benefiting from a major infrastructure such as Stanton Yellowknife, Stanton and Yellowknife? And that also serves the communities as well. So those are just, we have to be open-minded, and we serve 33 communities, and not 32 communities, but 33 communities. So when it comes to infrastructure programming, I'm a firm believer that we should discuss all projects that are before us and make decisions on our priorities and our mandates coming from this assembly members. And there will be times that we have to make tough decisions where a project from, let's say, instead of going Yellowknife, because it's a major issue that's happening in South 2 region, then we should seriously consider it. But it should have input from members as well before we proceed with that. So with that, Mr. Chair, merci.
Thank you, Mr. Lafferty. Ms. Cochran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I've often stated in this House and in public that society is judged by how we treat our most marginalized populations. However, I also have stated in this House that I come from a family of 8 children. So at no time did my parents give the youngest child all the food. Every child in that family of 8 was provided food enough to live. I've heard here today we need to support our Indigenous governments in our small communities, and we absolutely do. However, we have to also be conscious that half the population is in Yellowknife. I have a special gift, Mr. Chair, in that I'm Métis and that my mother, like I said, is Indigenous and my father's non-Indigenous. And that taught me from very young to be able to take care of all the needs of all people. So we're not only Indigenous people in the Northwest Territories, half of us are Caucasian or non-Indigenous as well. So we have an obligation to take care of everyone. However, we need to be just within that. So in my speech, I talked about having economic development plans for every region, and that is critical. But when I said every region, I meant every region. And the capital is part of our community of the Northwest Territories, and we cannot forget the needs as well. So it's not one over the other, it's everybody gets a piece of the pie in a fair way. The Polytechnic University is a great example. I know that some people are saying don't build in Yellowknife. However, Yellowknife campus is bursting at the seams. Fort Smith and Inuvik, their student housing are needed. Do I just say one or the other? I have not said that. I've said right through 3 strong communities, 3 strong campuses, and at least 21 strong community learning centers. So every decision that we make in this House has to have the interests of all residents and all communities, not favoring one over the other, but not forgetting one because of the other. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Cochran. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I stated earlier, Yellowknife is, for decades, is one of the highest household incomes in Canada. It's been a very wealthy city, but the times could be changing. The 3 diamond mines are facing closures within the decade. That would result in, hundreds of millions of dollars exiting the city. There could be a possible population drain, and there are challenges that the Yellowknife is facing, and we need to prepare for those challenges. How do we do that? Well, that's why I'm looking forward to the priorities meeting that we're having next week, because I spend a lot of time here. I try not to spend too much, but I'm not the expert on Yellowknife. I'm not the expert on mining, and I'd like to hear from the rest of the members. But we do need to prepare for the future. I've said many times that it seems like every assembly is just scrambling to catch up with whatever disaster is currently occurring. I mean, you look at the Slave Geological Road, I think Diefenbaker brought that up in 52 or 56. The Mackenzie Valley Highway, I mean, before I was born, is when people were talking about that. And so we need some sort of long-term vision. We need to have a plan. I think that we always need to play to the strengths of communities or regions. In Hay River, I talk about, there's potential for growth, and so the government needs to support that. So we need to support the potential for growth in Yellowknife. Tourism is big here. It could be much bigger, but there are limitations in terms of hotels, in terms of facilities and all that kind of stuff. We need to look at, the prospect of a university. Are the headquarters going to move to Yellowknife? I don't think so. But is there a potential for growth? This is a city where people from outside of the territory want to move. It's attractive in a lot of ways, especially for young professionals. And so I can see parts of a university thriving here. And so those are the kind of things that we need to be talking about, and I look forward to having those conversations. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Finally, Ms. Martselos.
I believe that Yellowknife will exist within the Northwest Territories, and we're all here to make sure all regions are treated equally. But you know what? The concentration of the wealth in Yellowknife has got to be spread to other regions. And with the new priority of the Polytech University, the 2 main campuses have got to be Fort Smith with its headquarters and Inuvik, because I think that's where it has to be. I'm not saying that you're going to close down the campus here in Yellowknife, but it's much easier, capital-wise and dollar-wise, to build the new residents that are required both in Inuvik and Fort Smith than it is in Yellowknife. And it only makes sense that the regional development of this campus is necessary so that we start spreading the wealth of it. I firmly believe that the regions have also got to exist within the whole Northwest Territories. I respect all the people of the Northwest Territories, no matter where they come from, what walk of life they come from. And I appreciate the question, but I also have to remember that the small communities in the regions are not up to the same standard of living as you have here in Yellowknife. And so I think that It was pretty obvious yesterday that it came out very clear from the Indigenous leaders that we have to do things differently. And I think this government has got to ensure that that mandate is kept. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Martselos. We've reached the noon hour. As such, we will now take a 1-hour break for lunch, and we will reconvene here at 1 p.m. this afternoon. Thank you, members.